She was 8 months pregnant, making breakfast, when her stepdaughter's voice floated in from the next room. "Serena, why does Daddy sound so mean on here?" What Serena heard next would stop her heart cold. 7 hours of recordings, her husband's voice, another woman's laughter. A plan so calculated, so merciless, it had been years in the making. He wasn't just cheating, he was going to take everything, her children, her freedom, her mind. And he didn't know she was already listening. Drop a like and comment your city below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Every single second of this matters. The eggs were burning. Serena DeLuca noticed the smell before she noticed anything else. That sharp, acrid bite of scorched protein curling up from the pan. The kind of smell that meant she'd been standing at the stove doing nothing for too long. She turned the burner down with one hand and pressed the other flat against the underside of her belly, steadying herself the way she'd learned to do over the past few weeks, when the weight of the pregnancy had started pulling her center of gravity somewhere below her knees. 8 months. 33 weeks and 4 days, to be precise, because she'd stopped counting in months the way the book said you were supposed to and started counting in days the way her body demanded. Every morning was a negotiation with her own skeleton. Hips that ached before she even swung her legs over the side of the bed. A lower back that had forgotten what it felt like not to be on fire. Ankles that by evening looked like something you'd find in a butcher's window. She scraped the eggs onto a plate anyway. Ellie would eat them. Ellie ate everything, a quality Serena had always admired in the girl, this uncomplicated relationship with food that Serena herself had lost somewhere in her 20s and never fully recovered. The kitchen in the Moretti house was enormous by any reasonable measure. 12-foot ceilings, marble countertops the color of old bone, a range that cost more than most people's cars. Serena had never asked for any of it. When she and Damien married 4 years ago, she'd come from a one-bedroom apartment in Hoboken with a second-hand couch and a coffee maker she'd bought at a garage sale. She'd told him once that she didn't need the big house. He'd smiled that slow, deliberate smile of his, the one that meant he'd already decided and was simply waiting for you to catch up, and said, "You'll get used to it." She had. That was the part that bothered her most, on mornings when she had the mental space to let it bother her. She had gotten used to it. The sound came from down the hall. Ellie's room, a high, clear 7-year-old voice talking to herself the way she always did when she was absorbed in something on her tablet. Serena couldn't make out the words yet, just the cadence of it, the innocent self-narration of a child who hadn't yet learned to edit herself in front of other people. Serena set the plate on the counter and started on the toast. Damien had left early. A meeting, he'd said, with the kind of vagueness he'd perfected over years of not explaining himself to anyone. She hadn't asked where. She'd stopped asking those questions somewhere in the 2nd year of their marriage, when she'd begun to understand that the answers she received were not the answers to the questions she was actually asking. He had an entire architecture of half-truths, each one technically accurate and fundamentally misleading, and he deployed them with the casual ease of a man who'd been doing it since before she was born. She was spreading butter on the toast when Ellie appeared in the kitchen doorway, tablet in hand, pink pajamas rumpled, dark hair going in 4 directions at once. "Serena." "Morning, Bug. Eggs are on the counter." "Serena." The second time, her voice had a different quality, not distressed exactly, more like confused in a way that required adult intervention. Serena turned around. Ellie was holding the tablet out toward her with both hands, the way you'd present something you weren't sure was broken. Her expression was that particular combination of uncertain and earnest that Serena had come to associate with things that required careful handling. A dead bird in the backyard, a classmate who'd said something cruel, a show that had a scary part she couldn't understand. "Why does Daddy sound so mean on here?" Serena set the butter knife down. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, which was not nothing at 8 months pregnant, and took the tablet from Ellie's hands. The screen showed a children's game app, the one Ellie had been playing obsessively for the past 6 weeks, something involving cartoon animals collecting flowers across pastel landscapes. Serena had downloaded it herself after Ellie's pediatrician recommended screen time that had at least some interactive component, but the game wasn't open. What was open was a folder Serena didn't recognize, buried under the game's interface, something the app had apparently created on its own, An audio archive labeled with dates and timestamps. Dozens of files going back months. The most recent one was playing. The voice coming out of the tablet's speaker was unmistakably Damien's. Serena's thumb moved to pause it. She didn't know why she paused it before she'd heard enough to understand what she was pausing. Some instinct, maybe. Some animal part of her brain that processed threat faster than language could. She looked at Ellie. Go eat your eggs. But why does he... Ellie. Not harsh, but firm, in the way that Serena had learned to be firm when she needed the child to move without negotiating, without the 3 rounds of why that was Ellie's constitutional right as a 7-year-old. Eggs, please. Ellie went. Serena stood at the kitchen counter with the tablet in her hand and her heart doing something irregular in her chest. She put in her earbuds. She pressed play. For the next 40 seconds, she heard nothing she could parse. Ambient sound, the creak of furniture, what might have been a door closing somewhere off-frame. And then Damien's voice, unhurried and low, speaking to someone who wasn't in the room where the tablet had been left, or maybe speaking somewhere the tablet's microphone had managed to reach through walls or vents or the particular acoustic luck of an old building. She's not going to be a problem, not after the birth. They all fall apart after the birth. A woman's voice. Warm, precise, slightly amused. And if she doesn't, then we help her along. Serena's thumb stopped the recording. She stood very still. Outside the window, a car moved down the private road that led away from the house. One of Damien's men, probably, doing the slow morning patrol they did every day without fail. The sun was coming through the east-facing windows at a sharp winter angle, hitting the marble countertops and bouncing off in cold, hard lines. She had 37 recordings to go. She started from the beginning. The app, as best Serena could piece it together over the following 20 minutes of methodical review, was called Pet Pal's Adventure. It had a microphone permission enabled. She vaguely remembered the prompt when she'd first downloaded it, something about voice commands for the cartoon characters, and she'd tapped allow without thinking because the alternative was explaining to a frustrated 6-year-old why she couldn't make her bunny speak. The app's privacy policy, which Serena had not read because no one read privacy policies, apparently included a feature that recorded ambient audio in the background to improve user experience, a data collection function that some junior software engineer had built into the thing and that no one at the company had apparently thought to make more visible. The result was 7 hours and 14 minutes of audio, spread across 41 separate files, recorded at irregular intervals over the course of the past 4 months in whatever room Ellie had left her tablet charging. Damien's home office, the master bedroom, the dining room where he held certain meetings he apparently considered private enough to hold at home, but not private enough to warrant a sweep for devices. Serena sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets because standing had become complicated, and sitting at the table felt somehow insufficient for what she was doing. She listened with her earbuds in and her eyes fixed on the middle distance and her face as neutral as she could make it, because there was a 7-year-old girl 8 feet away eating scrambled eggs and watching cartoons on the small television mounted under the cabinet. And Serena had already decided that Ellie was not going to remember this morning as the morning Serena DeLuca came apart in the kitchen. The second file she opened had been recorded 6 weeks ago, based on the timestamp. The quality was better. Damien must have been in the dining room, close to wherever Ellie had left the tablet, and his voice came through with the kind of clarity that made it impossible to rationalize as something other than what it was. He was talking to someone named Bianca. Serena knew the name, Bianca Romano. She'd been introduced at 2 or 3 Moretti family events over the years as the consigliere. Marco Romano's daughter, a woman in her mid-30s who moved through rooms the way water moved through narrow spaces, efficiently in the direction of the lowest resistance, filling every available gap. She'd always struck Serena as precisely the kind of woman who would be very good at things that required patience and calculation. Apparently she was. The conversation in the second file was not long, 15 minutes, some of it inaudible as they moved around the room. But what Serena could hear was enough. Damien had been planning this for over 2 years. Not the affair, though the affair was clearly older than that. They spoke about it with the easy intimacy of people who had already moved past the part where they hid it from themselves. What he had been planning with the kind of methodical patience that Serena had always privately admired in him when she thought it was directed outward, was the dismantling of her life. "The lawyers are already positioned," he said, at a point in the conversation where someone had just laughed about something Serena couldn't hear. "Harlan's been managing the language in the prenuptial documentation for 18 months. By the time she figures out what she signed, there's nothing left to contest." Bianca's voice. "And the children?" A pause. "Ellie's not a problem. She's not mine biologically. I've already started pulling back, letting her attach to Serena so that when the time comes, it's Serena who's the point of continuity for the girl. Makes it cleaner. And the baby?" "The baby is a Moretti," said with a flatness that was somehow worse than emphasis. "The baby stays with me, under your influence eventually. She'll be raised correctly." Serena's hand was pressed against her stomach. She didn't remember putting it there. She kept listening. What? She listened for 2 hours and 40 minutes while Ellie finished breakfast and moved to her room and came back twice to ask questions. Once about whether she could have more juice, once about whether there was something wrong with Serena's face. Serena said yes to the juice and no to the question about her face, and both times she kept her voice at the exact same temperature, which was the hardest thing she'd done in recent memory, and she had recently pushed a human being through a birth canal. That part was still ahead of her, she reminded herself, which felt like the universe's darkest joke. By the time she'd worked through the key files, not all 41, but the ones that the timestamp suggested corresponded to the most sustained conversations, she had a rough architecture of what Damien had built and what it was designed to do. The financial piece was the foundation. Over the course of their marriage, he had moved significant assets through a series of offshore accounts structured to appear dormant until activated by specific triggers that his people controlled. The assets that appeared in their shared name, the house, 2 investment accounts, a small commercial property in New Jersey, were, as far as Serena could tell from what she heard, either encumbered by debts she hadn't known about or structured such that her claim to them was substantially weaker than her name on the paperwork suggested. A man named Harlan Meade, the family's primary attorney, a person Serena had always experienced as professionally courteous and vaguely reptilian, had apparently been the architect of this. He appeared in 4 separate recordings, always in Damien's office, his voice precise and unhurried, reviewing structures and percentages the way a contractor reviews load-bearing specifications. The legal piece was built on top of that. Damien had, over the past 8 months, quietly assembled documentation, some of it fabricated, from what she could piece together, some of it real events recontextualized, designed to support a specific narrative about Serena's mental state during the pregnancy. Mood instability, erratic behavior. 2 incidents at dinner parties that Serena remembered as benign moments of exhausted irritability had apparently been carefully described in writing by guests who, she now understood, had been specifically positioned to observe them. The plan was to introduce this documentation after the birth, during what Damien and his people had identified as the window of maximum vulnerability, the weeks immediately postpartum, when Serena would be physically depleted, emotionally raw, and isolated in the house with a newborn. The custody piece was the capstone. He had a judge, or something close enough to a judge as to make the distinction irrelevant, and a family court arrangement that Bianca had described in one recording as airtight on our end, non-existent on hers. The baby, their daughter, the one currently pressing a foot against Serena's ribs with the casual indifference of someone who didn't know she was a pawn, would be assigned to Damien's primary custody within 60 days of her birth. Serena would be positioned as unstable, isolated from her support network because she didn't have one that existed outside the Moretti world, and financially dependent enough that fighting it would require resources she didn't have access to. Bianca would raise the baby. Damien had said this in the clearest language of anything she'd heard. Bianca will raise her. She'll be a Moretti in the way that counts, not just by blood. Serena sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets and the tablet in her hands, and her daughter moving inside her, and she did not cry. She thought about crying. She examined the possibility of it the way you'd examine a tool you weren't sure you needed for the job. And then she set it aside because crying was not the thing she needed right now. Right now, she needed to think clearly, and she needed to move very carefully, and above all, she needed to understand something that had just become the most important question in her life. Did Damien know the tablet had recorded him? She replayed the conversation in her head. Ellie's question this morning, "Why does Daddy sound so mean on here?" She hadn't known what she was listening to. She'd heard her father's voice and found it confusing and brought it to Serena the way she brought everything confusing to Serena, which was one of the small, tender facts about their relationship that Serena had never taken for granted and would not be losing. But if Ellie had found it this morning, and if Ellie had been playing with the tablet in any normal way over the past week, it was possible, not certain, but possible, that Damien didn't know the files existed. The app ran background. He was not the kind of man who looked at children's tablets. He was not the kind of man who thought a cartoon animal flower game was worth his attention. She had a window. She didn't know how wide it was. She got herself off the floor, which took longer than it should have, and walked to the small desk in the kitchen corner where she kept her own laptop, the personal one that predated the marriage and had never, as far as she knew, been touched or accessed by anyone in Damien's world. She connected the tablet and she copied every audio file, all 41 of them, 7 hours and 14 minutes of her husband's voice laying out the blueprint for her destruction, onto the laptop's hard drive. Then she sent them to her cloud storage, the old account she'd had since college, accessed by credentials she'd never shared with anyone. Then she removed the tablet from the connection and put it back on the kitchen counter exactly where Ellie had left it, because Ellie might come looking for it and it needed to look exactly the way it had always looked. She checked the time. 8:47 in the morning. Damien had said he'd be back by noon. She had 3 hours. The problem with being married to Damien Moretti was not the violence. Not directly. The violence was always there in the way that load-bearing walls are always there. You stopped noticing them after a while, became aware of them only when you thought about taking them down. What you lived with day to day was something subtler and more exhausting. It was the management of his attention, the constant calibration of what he knew and what he believed you knew, what he allowed you to see and what he permitted himself to reveal in your presence, the performance of being a wife in exactly the way he required, attentive without being demanding, present without being intrusive, soft enough not to threaten, and capable enough to be worth keeping. Serena had been good at it. She had not known, for most of those 4 years, quite how good at it she was. She'd thought of it as compromise, as the ordinary work of a marriage, the give and take that every relationship required. She understood now that what she'd actually been doing was surviving inside a controlled environment without realizing the environment was controlled. She made herself a cup of tea. Weak, no caffeine, the kind she'd been drinking for 8 months because the obstetrician had said to limit stimulants. Her hands were steady, which surprised her a little. She'd expected them to shake. She thought about who she could call. Her parents were in Florida, retired, healthy, entirely removed from this world, which was a mercy. She had a sister in Portland she hadn't spoken to properly in 2 years, not because of any falling out, but because the Moretti life had a centripetal quality to it, pulling everything toward the center and making the periphery feel far and effortful. She had friends, or the social approximations of friends, women she saw at events, people whose numbers were in her phone and who would take her calls, but none of whom existed outside the orbit of Damien's world. They were his people's wives, his world's women, and she had no illusion about where their loyalties would land if this became a conflict. She needed someone outside. The thought arrived fully formed, without preamble, which was how the most important thoughts sometimes arrived in crisis. She needed a lawyer, not a family lawyer, not the kind of attorney who handled divorces and custody agreements in the normal geography of normal lives. She needed someone who understood what she was dealing with, who had handled cases adjacent to organized crime, who would not be reachable or purchasable by the Moretti network. She also needed to figure out what she was actually holding, because 7 hours of audio was only valuable if the content was legally actionable, and she couldn't assess that herself. She was a former marketing director with a background in communications and a good eye for narrative structure, not a federal attorney. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and spent 30 minutes doing something she'd never done before in this house, searching for information she'd actually need in terms that were specific enough to be useful. Attorney Organized Crime RICO Defense, Family Law Custody Criminal Organization. Federal witness protection eligible. She searched carefully. In browser windows she planned to clear before Damien got home, building a rough picture of the landscape she'd just been dropped into. What she found both clarified and terrified her. The recordings, if authentic and legally obtained, could be powerful. But the question of legal obtainment was complicated. An app collecting ambient audio without the user's explicit, knowing consent occupied murky territory in several jurisdictions. She'd need a lawyer to parse whether the recordings were admissible and under what framework. She'd need someone who understood how federal investigators handled material like this, because this wasn't just a divorce. These recordings documented money laundering. They documented witness intimidation. They documented what sounded very much like conspiracy to commit custodial interference through fraudulent legal means. These weren't matters for a family court. These were matters for people with federal jurisdiction. She also needed to move carefully, because if Damien found out she knew, the situation would change in ways she didn't want to contemplate. He was not a man who managed threats by negotiating with them. By 10:30, she had two names. She'd found the first one through a combination of legal databases and a profile in a Philadelphia magazine from 3 years ago, Vivian Cross, a former assistant U.S. attorney who had gone into private practice handling complex civil and criminal matters, and who had, in a footnote in one article, been described by a federal prosecutor as the attorney you don't want opposing you when the other side has institutional power. The second name she found connected to the first, Logan Pierce, former federal investigator, now consulting on private matters involving organized crime exposure, mentioned in the same article as someone Cross had worked with on a case involving a mid-level crime family in New Jersey. Cross and Pierce, neither of them inside the Moretti world, both of them with the specific background that this specific situation required. Serena wrote both names and their contact information on a piece of paper, which she folded and put in the front pocket of her maternity jeans, the pocket she'd sewn closed with a few stitches 3 months ago because the opening had been annoying her. She cleared her browser history. She closed the laptop. She had 40 minutes before Damien was due back. She thought about the baby, their daughter. She'd been trying out names, privately, in the small interior space she'd carved out for things that were just hers. And she'd settled months ago on Isabella, though she hadn't told Damien because he'd wanted to name the baby after his grandmother, and she'd been trying to figure out how to handle it. The baby's name was, she realized now, not the issue she thought it was. The baby's survival inside a life of her own choosing was the issue. Ellie appeared in the kitchen doorway for the third time that morning, barefoot, holding a coloring book. "Can we do colors before Daddy gets home?" Serena looked at her. Ellie's mother had died when Ellie was 14 months old. A car accident, the kind of thing that happens and leaves a family reshaped around the gap. Serena had come into Ellie's life when Ellie was 3, and they had built something together in the years since, quietly and without a great deal of ceremony. Not replacing what Ellie had lost, just being what Ellie needed day by day, which had turned out to be its own kind of love. Damien had said on those recordings that Ellie wasn't a problem. He had engineered her attachment to Serena, had, it sounded like, deliberately allowed this relationship to deepen so that when he removed himself and Serena from Ellie's primary care, the transition would be managed. He had calculated even this small, hard-won thing. Serena felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't grief exactly. It was harder than grief. It had edges. "Yeah," she said. "Let's do colors." Damien came home at 12:15, which was 15 minutes later than he'd said, and exactly on time by his own internal schedule, which operated according to its own rules that had nothing to do with what he'd told you to expect. He came through the garage entrance the way he always did, dropping his coat on the chair by the door that existed specifically for him to drop his coat on, kissing Serena on the cheek in the kitchen with the particular quality of attention that meant he was physically present and mentally somewhere else. "How are you feeling?" He glanced at her stomach. He always looked at her stomach now with this proprietary quality, this assessment that she had for months misread as concern. "Tired," she said. "My back." "You should sit more." "I know." He went to the refrigerator and stood in front of it with the door open, not taking anything, just looking. She watched him from across the kitchen. He was 44 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that would have been conventionally handsome if it hadn't been arranged into its default expression of contained authority. He wore it like clothing. She wondered now how long it had taken him to perfect it, whether it had ever been real, whether the man she'd married had ever existed, or whether she'd simply been looking at this the whole time and reading it wrong. "Where's Ellie?" he asked. "Nap." He closed the refrigerator without taking anything, turned and looked at Serena with the full weight attention he deployed selectively, the look that meant he was assessing something. She kept her face at the temperature she'd been practicing all morning. "You look pale." "I'm always pale," she said, "more than usual." "Damien." She let her voice carry the particular note of mild exhaustion she'd perfected, the sound of a woman who was tired and uncomfortable and needed the world to require slightly less of her. "I'm 8 months pregnant. I look however I look." He almost smiled. The almost smile that meant the assessment had concluded and she had passed, at least for now. "I've got calls this afternoon. I'll be in the office." "Okay. Order something for lunch. Don't stand at the stove." "I won't." He left the kitchen. She heard his office door close down the hall. She stood at the kitchen counter and put one hand on the marble surface and breathed with her eyes closed for a count of 10, letting the adrenaline move through her and out, the way her midwife had taught her to do when the pregnancy anxiety spiked. In through the nose, out through the mouth, and let whatever's moving through you keep moving. She opened her eyes. She was going to need to be very good at this, better than she'd ever been. For however long it took to get out of this house, out of this life, out of the reach of what Damien had spent 2 years constructing around her without her knowledge, she was also going to need help. The call she made 3 days later, from a gas station payphone 20 minutes from the house, during what she'd told Damien was a prenatal appointment, lasted 11 minutes. She'd explained the situation to the assistant on the other end, who had taken the information with a professionalism that Serena had found, in the moment, almost more reassuring than comfort would have been. She didn't need comfort. She needed someone who wasn't going to panic. Vivian Cross called her back within the hour, on the same payphone number Serena had given, and what followed was the most important 14-minute conversation of Serena's life. Cross had a voice like a wire, thin and hard and carrying current. She asked 6 questions. She did not express surprise at any of the answers. When Serena described the recordings, there was a pause. Not long, 3 or 4 seconds. And then Cross said, in a tone that was not quite warm, but was something adjacent to it, "How many files total?" 41. 7 hours and 14 minutes. Another pause. "Are they backed up?" 3 separate locations, 1 physical, 2 cloud. "Good." A brief silence that felt like Cross making a decision. "Don't access those backups again until we've talked further. Don't change your behavior inside the house in any way that might signal awareness." "Can you do that?" "Yes." "Can you get me time to review the recordings before you go into labor?" "I have 4 to 6 weeks." "That's enough." "I'm going to connect you with someone, Logan Pierce. He'll reach you through the same channel you used to reach me. Don't use your home phone or your personal cell for any of this." "I know." "Miss DeLuca." "Yes. Whoever you've been with this man, whatever version of yourself you've been inside that house, you're going to have to keep being her for a while longer." Serena watched a truck pull in off the road, the driver stepping down with the mechanical ease of someone who'd been doing this for years. "I know that too," she said. She hung up the phone, got back in the car, drove toward home at exactly the speed she always drove. She was 38 weeks pregnant, and she was going to war against the most powerful criminal organization in 3 states. And her only real advantage was that the man running that organization had never, not once in 4 years, thought she was worth watching. He was about to understand that mistake, but he didn't know it yet. And in her rearview mirror, the road behind her was empty the way he preferred things, clear, controlled, moving in the direction he'd planned. What he couldn't see was what she was already carrying, what she'd already done, what was stored in 3 separate places, patient as winter, waiting for its moment. She put her hand on her stomach. The baby pressed back. 4 weeks. Maybe 6. She could hold this for 4 weeks. She turned onto the private road and watched the gate open and drove back into the life she was already dismantling, piece by piece, before he'd even noticed the first piece was loose. Logan Pierce called on a Tuesday. Serena was in the upstairs bathroom when the burner phone she'd bought with cash at a truck stop outside Hackensack vibrated twice against the inside pocket of her robe, the signal she and Cross had agreed on, 2 short pulses before the actual call so she'd know who it was before she answered. She turned on the faucet. Background noise. Damien was 2 floors down in his office, and the house was large enough that sound didn't carry the way it did in normal buildings, but she'd stopped trusting what she thought she knew about this house. "Pierce," said the voice on the other end. No greeting, no preamble. "I'm here," she said. "Cross briefed me. I've reviewed what you described." A pause. "I need to hear the recordings myself before I tell you what you have. Can you get me access without moving the files?" "I can send you a secure link. Cross gave me a protocol." "Use it. All 41 files in order, with the timestamps intact. Don't compress them." Another pause, shorter. "How are you doing?" The question landed with a bluntness that made it feel more genuine than a softer version would have. Serena looked at herself in the mirror above the sink. The woman looking back at her was someone she was still getting used to. Wider through the face, heavier, with the particular exhaustion behind the eyes that pregnancy installed, and didn't remove, no matter how much sleep you got. "I'm managing," she said. "Good. Keep managing." He disconnected. She stood at the sink with the water running for another 30 seconds, just to complete the fiction of why she'd come up here, and then turned it off and went back downstairs. The recordings went to Pierce that night. She used the protocol Cross had outlined, a layered transfer through 2 intermediate servers that Cross's office maintained for exactly this kind of situation, the kind of situation that Serena was still working to fully accept was her situation. She sent the files from the burner phone with the bathroom faucet running again, which she was starting to understand was going to become a habit, and then she put the phone back in the place she'd chosen for it, inside the lining of her winter coat, the one hanging in the back of the hall closet that Damien never opened because it was too small for any of his things, and he treated anything too small for him as irrelevant. She went to bed at 10. Damien came in sometime after midnight, moving through the dark with the particular silence of someone who'd been doing this long enough not to think about it anymore. He got into bed on his side, and within 4 minutes his breathing had settled into the slow, even rhythm of someone who had no trouble sleeping. Serena lay on her side facing the window with her eyes open and her daughter moving in small, insistent rotations. And she thought about what she was holding and what was still coming and how long she could sustain this performance. She calculated 4 more weeks, maybe 5. She did not sleep until 3. The first indication that something was shifting came on a Thursday morning, 10 days after the files went to Pierce. She was eating breakfast alone. Ellie was at school. Damien had gone out early again, when his consigliere, a heavy-set man named Rudy Farrow, who had been with the Moretti organization since before Damien took over, and who wore his loyalty on his face the way some men wore bad weather, came through the kitchen without knocking the way he always did, because people in Damien's world understood that knocking was a formality reserved for people you respected on equal terms. Rudy Farrow did not respect Serena on equal terms. He was polite to her. There was a meaningful difference. "Morning," he said, opening the refrigerator without looking at her. "Damien leave already?" "About an hour ago." He took a bottle of water, looked at her for a moment with the flat, assessing quality that Serena had learned to read as something close to suspicion without a specific object yet. Generalized vigilance, the permanent condition of men in his position. "You look tired." "I'm almost 9 months pregnant, Rudy." "Right." He capped the bottle, kept looking at her. "You have that doctor's appointment today?" He knew her schedule. Of course he did. She'd known this on some level for years and had told herself it was a security precaution, the kind of monitoring a man in Damien's position performed on everything in his orbit. Now she understood that it had a more specific purpose, and she kept her face neutral. "Tomorrow," she said. He nodded, left. She waited until she heard his car pull away, and then sat with her hands flat on the table and breathed deliberately for 30 seconds. Because the way he'd looked at her, that particular quality of it, the extra half second he'd held it, had tripped something in her nervous system that she needed to talk herself down from before it showed. She called Cross from the burner phone at noon. "He was watching me differently," she said. "Describe differently." She described it. Cross was quiet for a moment. "It may be nothing. Men in that world are always watching. Has anything in Damien's behavior changed?" Serena thought about it honestly. "He's been home less, which isn't unusual, but the last 2 nights he's been—" She searched for the right word. "Careful." "Careful how?" "Not drinking. He usually has 2 glasses of something after dinner. He hasn't." Another silence. "That could mean a lot of things." "I know." "Pierce has been through 40% of the recordings," Cross said. "He says what you have is real. The financial documentation alone, if we can tie it to what's in the audio, is substantial, but Serena," her voice shifted slightly, "we need 2 more weeks minimum. Can you hold your current position for 2 more weeks?" "Yes," Serena said. And then, because it was the truth, and Cross had not once given her reason to soften things, "I think so." The fight happened on a Saturday. It was not, on the surface, about anything real. That was the architecture of it. The real thing stayed under the surface where Damien put everything he intended to manage on his own schedule. And what came up through the floor was something smaller and more manageable that he could respond to and then file away as resolved. He came home in the afternoon to find Ellie in the living room with markers and a large piece of paper she'd spread across the coffee table, a project for school that had expanded significantly beyond what a coffee table was designed to accommodate. Serena was on the couch nearby, a pillow behind her lower back, reading something on her phone. Damien stood in the doorway for a moment with his coat still on. "This isn't the place for that," he said. Ellie looked up. The markers went still. "It's a project," Serena said. She needed space. "The table." His voice was the even, controlled temperature that meant he was not going to elevate this, but he was going to win it. "Is not for art projects." "Damien, she's 7. She needed—" "I know how old she is." He looked at Ellie. "Clean this up and take it to your room." Ellie started gathering markers. Serena watched the girl's hands move with the particular efficiency of a child who had learned when to argue and when to comply, which was its own quiet tragedy, and she felt the thing in her chest that had been building since that morning on the kitchen floor pull tighter. She waited until Ellie was gone. "You didn't have to do that in front of her." Damien set his coat on the chair. "I came home to a living room that looked like a kindergarten. She's a child living in this house. I know that." He turned and looked at her with the full weight attention again, and there was something in it that was different from the last time. Something slightly more present, slightly more directed. "What's going on with you?" "Nothing's going on with me." "You're agitated." "I'm 9 months pregnant, Damien. I am not going to perform serenity for you." He was quiet for a moment, looked at her steadily. She held it, met his eyes with the particular quality of tired irritability she was using as cover, not looking away but not loading the look with anything, just tired, just heavy, just a woman at the end of a hard pregnancy who wanted her stepdaughter to be able to color at the coffee table. "Go rest," he said finally. "I am resting." "Then rest better." He picked up his coat and walked out. She sat on the couch and listened to his footsteps down the hall and his office door closing, and then sat for another long moment in the silence, breathing slowly, feeling her daughter rotate under her ribs. She had held it. But the way he'd looked at her, that direction, that specificity, had not felt like the standard assessment. It had felt like he was looking for something. Thus, Pierce called 4 days before her due date. She was in the upstairs bathroom again. The faucet was running. "I've been through everything," he said. "All 41 files." She waited. "What you have is significant. The financial material, the offshore structures he describes, the names he uses, the account references. We've already been able to cross-reference 3 of them against structures that federal investigators have had on their radar for 2 years as part of a broader inquiry into the Moretti organization." A pause. "He didn't know he was being recorded." "No. The way he talks in those recordings, the specificity, the detail, This is a man who believed he was completely secure. People don't talk the way he talks in those recordings when they think anyone's listening. What does that mean for what we can do with it? It means the content is real and unguarded, Pierce said. It also means we need to think carefully about how we introduce it, because the admissibility question is genuinely complicated, and we don't want to hand his lawyers a technical path to suppression. He was quiet for a moment. Cross is working the legal angle. I've been working a different angle. Which is? Whether there are federal investigators who already have interest in the Moretti organization who would find this material valuable enough to pursue through their own channels in ways that don't require the admissibility question to be answered in family court. She understood what he was saying. You're talking about giving the recordings to federal prosecutors. I'm talking about making sure that option is on the table and properly understood before you file anything. Another pause. Are you still safe in that house? Yes. You're sure? As sure as I can be. A brief silence. Serena, if at any point that changes, if he gives you any indication that he knows what you have, you call me and you take Ellie and you leave. You don't wait for the legal strategy. You don't wait for anything. You understand? Yes, she said. She turned off the faucet and went back into the bedroom and lay down on her side with her eyes open and her daughter pressing against her ribs and the phone warm in her hand. And she thought about everything Pierce had just said and what it meant and how close they were and how much closer they needed to get before she could move. 3 days later, Damien came home late and went directly to his office and did not come out until after she was asleep. And when she woke at 2 a.m, she could hear from somewhere below her the low murmur of a phone call. His voice, Damien's voice, at an hour when Damien did not make calls, speaking with the careful, controlled quietness of a man who is managing something. She lay still. She did not get up. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the murmur she couldn't make out and felt the weight of everything she was carrying. The baby, the recordings, the plan, the performance. The 4 years of a life that had never been what she thought it was. And she understood, with the particular clarity that arrives in the small dark hours when there is no noise left to fill the space between you and the truth, that the window she had been working inside was narrowing. She didn't know yet what Damien had learned. She didn't know what the phone call was about, or who it was with, or whether it was about her at all. It might have been business. It was almost always business. But the way he'd looked at her over the past 2 weeks, that directed, specific, searching quality, and the call at 2 a.m, and Rudy Farrow's extra half-second in the kitchen, these things were accumulating into a shape she could almost see, and the shape it was making was not one she wanted to let fully form before she was ready. She reached under the mattress on her side, where the burner phone was taped to the frame in a position she could reach without sitting up. She held it in her hand in the dark and did not use it, because there was nothing to say yet. Nothing she could confirm or act on at 2 a.m. at 9 months pregnant with her husband on the phone 1 floor below. But her water broke at 4:17 in the morning, which was the one variable that no amount of planning had been able to fully account for, and as she sat up in the dark with the unmistakable physical fact of it registering through her body, she understood that whatever window she had been working inside had just closed, and whatever was going to happen next was going to happen on a timeline that was no longer hers to choose. She turned on the bedside lamp. Damien? He was already sitting up. The phone call, whenever it had ended, had apparently not resulted in much sleep. He looked at her with the immediate, sharp attention of someone who had not been fully unconscious. She watched his face, and what she saw in it, in the first unguarded second before he arranged it into the appropriate expression of a husband whose wife had just gone into labor, was not concern. It was calculation. The hospital room was white and cold and smelled like antiseptic and floor wax, and Serena labored in it for 11 hours while Damien sat in the chair by the window and managed his phone with the practiced discretion of a man conducting business he had no intention of explaining. She noticed. She noticed everything now. She noticed the way he angled the screen away from her sightline, the way he stepped out twice, once for 20 minutes, once for 35, and returned each time with his face arranged into the correct configuration of an attentive husband, but his eyes still somewhere else, still processing whatever the phone had given him. She noticed that he did not hold her hand during the contractions the way he had during the false labor 3 weeks ago, when he'd been performing devoted husband for an audience that included two of his men in the waiting room. Today there was no audience. Today the performance was minimal. She also noticed, during the second hour, that Rudy Farrow was in the hallway. She'd seen him through the small window in the door, just a glimpse, his profile, the particular set of his shoulders that she'd learned to read across 4 years of proximity. He wasn't there visiting. He was stationed. There was a difference. She said nothing about it. She breathed through the contractions and answered the nurse's questions, and when Damien came back from his second absence, she looked at him with the expression of a woman in pain who needed her husband close, which was close enough to what she was actually feeling that it didn't require much work. Isabella arrived at 3:17 in the afternoon, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Dark hair, the same shade as Ellie's, the same shade as Damien's, which was either genetic continuity or the universe's particular sense of irony. She was placed on Serena's chest, and Serena held her with both arms and felt the full weight of what she was holding. Not just the baby, not just the 7 pounds of new human being making its first sounds against her collarbone, but everything this child represented in the architecture of what was coming, what had already been decided about her by a man sitting 4 feet away before she'd drawn her first breath. Damien came to stand beside the bed. He looked at Isabella with an expression Serena couldn't fully decode, something genuine in it, or something that had once been genuine and had since been routed through calculation so many times that the two things were no longer separable. He put one finger against the baby's cheek. "She's perfect," he said. Serena said, "Yes." He looked up at her. Their eyes met over the baby's head, and for a moment, one undefended moment, she thought she saw something in him that might have been real. Regret, maybe, or its ghost. And then it was gone, and he was back behind the face he wore, and she was back behind hers, and Isabella lay between them making small sounds that neither of them addressed because they were both, in their separate silences, thinking about what happened next. She was home in 4 days. The house had been prepared to... Someone had set up the bassinet in the master bedroom, stocked the kitchen with the things a new mother was supposed to need, placed flowers on the dresser that Serena did not ask about and Damien did not explain. It had the quality of a stage set, everything in its correct position for the scene that was supposed to play. Cross called on day 3. Burner phone, bathroom, faucet. Serena stood at the sink with Isabella asleep in the other room and her body still recalibrating from the birth, the particular physical strangeness of suddenly not being pregnant after 9 months of it, like a ship that had been carrying weight on one side for so long that being balanced again felt like listing. "How are you?" Cross asked. "Functional. Good. Pierce has made contact." A brief pause. "Serena, I need to tell you something before we go further, and I need you to stay steady when I do." She gripped the edge of the sink. "Tell me." "The federal investigation into the Moretti organization, the one Pierce identified as having prior interest in the financial structures on the recordings, is more advanced than we knew. They've been building a case for 14 months. They already have material." Cross's voice was even, controlled, delivering this the way you'd deliver weight you'd been carrying and needed to set down. "Some of that material involves names that appear on the recordings you gave us." "Okay." "One of the names is Harlan Meade, Damien's lawyer, the architect of the financial structures. Serena had known this was coming in some form." "He's been cooperating?" "Not with us. With them. He's been a confidential source for the federal investigation for approximately 7 months." She stood very still. The water ran. "What does that mean for our position?" "It means the federal investigation already knows about several of the structures Damien describes on the recordings. It also means..." Cross stopped. Just for a half second, and in that half second, Serena felt something shift. "It means Harlan Meade has been in a position to observe the legal arrangements he built for Damien, including the family court arrangements, the custody strategy." Cross. "He's been reporting on those too, to the federal investigators." Serena let out a breath. "So they already know what Damien planned to do to me." "They know some of it, not from our recordings, from Meade's reports, which means..." Another careful pause. "Which means there are federal investigators who have been aware, for some months, that Damien Moretti planned to use fraudulent legal mechanisms to secure custody of your child. And they didn't. She stopped herself, felt the anger move through her, quick and hot, and then gone, because anger was not useful right now. They were protecting their case. Yes. She looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was thinner in the face than she'd been a week ago, which was the strange gift of childbirth, and had the hollowed-out eyes of someone surviving on 2-hour sleep intervals, and was in the middle of a conversation that she could not have imagined having 4 months ago. Does Damien know about Meade? We don't know. If he finds out his own lawyer has been feeding information to federal investigators for 7 months, it changes his timeline, Cross said. Yes, it potentially accelerates what he planned to do after the birth. Serena looked at the ceiling, breathed. How much time do we have? Pierce is meeting with the federal team tomorrow. He'll have a clearer picture after that. But Serena, if Damien moves before we're ready, you need to be somewhere he can't reach you. I know. Do you have a way out of that house that doesn't require his cooperation? I've been thinking about it. Think faster. She thought faster. The problem was Ellie. Ellie was in school until 3:15 every weekday, and the school ran 2 of Damien's people through its parent volunteer program. She'd understood this vaguely for years as security, understood it now as surveillance, which were the same infrastructure serving different purposes depending on which side of it you were on. Taking Ellie out of school without notice would register. It would register fast. The problem was also the house itself. It was gated. The staff were Damien's people. The housekeeper, a woman named Carmen, who had worked for the Moretti family for 11 years, and who was kind to Serena in the way that people are kind to someone they know, is not going to be around much longer. The drivers were all his. The cars available to Serena were tracked. She'd confirmed this 18 months ago when she'd noticed the small additional device under the wheel well of the SUV she drove and had chosen, at the time, not to react to it. She had the burner phone. She had the cloud backups. She had Cross and Pierce. What she did not yet have was a clean path out, and she needed one before she needed it, because the moment she needed it without having it, it would already be too late. She spent 3 days thinking in the spaces Damien left her, the hours when Isabella slept and Damien was out and Carmen was in the other wing of the house doing whatever she did in the afternoons. She thought carefully, and she moved nothing yet, and she gave Damien no change in temperature to measure. And then, on a Tuesday evening, 12 days after Isabella's birth, she found the folder. So she hadn't been looking for it. She'd been going through the filing cabinet in the home office, the shared one, not Damien's locked private office, the one that contained the household documentation that was theoretically accessible to both of them, because she needed Isabella's birth certificate for the pediatrician's appointment, and the hospital had sent a copy to the house rather than directly to her. She was moving through the hanging files, still slower than usual because the incision from the birth had not fully closed, and bending was an exercise in careful management, when her fingers found a folder filed behind the household insurance documents that didn't belong with household insurance documents. It was thin, 4 sheets of paper clipped together. The top sheet was a document she recognized immediately, because she'd seen its structure in one of the recordings, a summary memo on letterhead she didn't recognize, addressed to no one by name, describing a set of legal petitions and their projected filing dates. The second sheet was a completed petition for emergency custody modification, citing documented instability of primary caregiver following childbirth, and attaching, as supporting documentation, the witness accounts she'd heard described on the recordings. Those 2 dinner party incidents, rewritten into formal language that made them sound like episodes rather than moments. The third sheet was a psychological evaluation. It had her name on it. It described symptoms of postpartum psychosis, including delusional thinking, auditory disturbance, and paranoid ideation. It was signed by a Dr. Felix Oren, whose letterhead identified him as a clinical psychiatrist in private practice in Bergen County. She had never met this man in her life. The fourth sheet was a letter, addressed to Harlan Meade, which landed in her chest with a particular weight given what Cross had told her about Meade's cooperation status. The letter was from Damien's private cell, drafted and apparently printed, but she could not tell if it had been sent. It described, in direct and unambiguous language, the timeline. The custody petition would be filed within the next 7 days. Serena would be served while still in the postpartum period, before she'd had time to establish outside legal representation. The psychological evaluation would be submitted simultaneously with a motion for emergency sole custody pending a competency evaluation. The motion would be heard by a judge named Calloway. She knew the name Calloway from one of the recordings. She stood in the home office with the 4 sheets of paper in her hand and her incision pulling, and Isabella in the bassinet down the hall, and the whole weight of what Damien had built pressing down from above. And she understood that she was not looking at a plan. She was looking at a countdown. 7 days. She had heard the number 7 in the context of this plan before, on the recordings, but she had thought, she had believed, because she'd needed to believe it, that the plan required more setup, more time, more of the postpartum window to develop before he'd move. She had built her own timeline around that assumption. 2 more weeks before she and Cross and Pierce were ready to file. 2 more weeks before the federal angle was fully coordinated. She'd been wrong. Or something had changed. Or Meade's cooperation had accelerated Damien's anxiety about his own exposure and pushed the timeline forward in ways he hadn't briefed her on because he didn't brief her on anything. She put the folder back exactly where she'd found it, closed the cabinet, straightened up slowly, one hand braced on the edge of the desk. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them for a moment with something close to academic interest. She'd held it this long without shaking, and now her hands were shaking at a filing cabinet in an empty room. And then she pressed them flat against the desk surface and held them there until they stopped. She went back down the hall. She checked on Isabella, who was still asleep, making the small rhythmic sounds of a human being whose world was warm and adequately oxygenated and had not yet presented her with anything to fear. Serena stood over the bassinet and looked at her daughter's face for a long moment, counting something that wasn't quite breaths and wasn't quite seconds, just measuring the space between where she was and where she needed to be. Then she went to the bathroom and turned on the faucet and called Cross. Cross answered on the second ring. This time of day, she usually answered on the first. "We have 7 days," Serena said. "Maybe less. He has a signed psychological evaluation from a doctor I've never seen. He has the custody petition drafted. He has a judge. It's all sitting in the household filing cabinet." A silence that lasted long enough for Serena to count to 4. He filed the folder in the shared cabinet, filed behind the insurance documents. Either he got careless or he wanted you to find it. Cross's voice had shifted. Something harder in it now, something that moved faster. If he knows you know about the recordings, leaving that folder where you'd find it is a message. The thought arrived cold and total. A message that it's too late to fight it. Or a message that he wants to see what you do next. A brief pause. Has anything in his behavior suggested he knows about your contacts with us? Serena thought about the 2 in the morning phone call. Rudy Farrow in the hospital hallway. The directed, specific quality of his attention over the past 2 weeks. She had assessed each of these individually and told herself they were below the threshold of certainty. Standing in the bathroom with the 4 sheets of paper receding in her memory but not in her hands, she reassembled them into a different shape. "Possibly," she said. "I don't know." "Serena, I need you to listen to me very carefully." Cross's voice had the wire quality again, the current in it. "If he knows, then we don't have 7 days. We have whatever he decides to give us, which could be nothing, which could be tonight." The faucet ran. Isabella made a sound from down the hall. Not crying, just the transitional sounds of a baby moving between sleep states. Serena stood with the phone against her ear and the water running and the reality of the situation settling into her body the way cold water settles, all at once, everywhere. "Pierce has a contact," Cross said. "A federal agent, not the full team, someone Pierce has worked with before. We can get the recordings in front of him informally before anything is filed. If we do that, the federal investigation picks up what we have, and it becomes theirs. It moves through channels that Damien cannot reach." She paused. "But we have to move tonight. Tonight. If we wait, and he moves first, that petition, that evaluation, a judge Damien controls. Serena, You could lose Isabella before we get in front of anyone who can help. She looked at herself in the mirror. She'd gotten very good over the past few months at looking at this woman and not flinching, at seeing someone who was managing and would continue to manage and would not come apart in front of the mirror or anywhere else. She looked at her now and understood that the version of this plan that had felt almost achievable, the careful, staged, legally airtight unfolding she and Cross and Pierce had been constructing, was no longer the plan. The plan was gone. What remained was something faster and dirtier, and with significantly less margin for error, and it had to begin right now, tonight, with Damien in the house. "What do I need to do?" she said. Cross told her. She turned off the faucet. She went down the hall. She picked up Isabella from the bassinet and held her against her shoulder and stood in the dim bedroom, the late evening light coming flat and gray through the blinds. And she listened to her daughter breathe and thought about what had to happen in the next 12 hours. And the woman she would have to become to make it happen. Someone harder than she'd been, more willing to use the weapons she had without waiting for the perfect moment, because the perfect moment had just been taken off the table. Down the hall, she heard Damien's office door open, his footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, moving toward the bedroom. She turned toward the door with Isabella on her shoulder and her face arranged into the only thing it could afford to be right now. And when he appeared in the doorway, she looked at him the way she had been looking at him for months, calmly, a little tired, contained. And he looked back at her with that searching quality and said nothing for a moment, just looked. Then, "You should sleep when she sleeps." "I know," Serena said. He nodded, went to his side of the room. She watched him from across the space that had always existed between them, the space she'd spent 4 years trying to understand and could now read with perfect clarity. And she knew, with the particular certainty that arrives when you have run out of room to be wrong, that whatever he was planning it for very soon, and that the only way to survive what was coming was to move first. She sat on the edge of the bed with Isabella warm and breathing against her shoulder, and her hand already moving slowly toward the place under the mattress where the burner phone was taped, and she thought, tonight. She sent the files at 11:43 at night. Damien was in the shower. She could hear the water through the wall, the particular acoustic signature of the master bath's pressure system, a sound she'd mapped without meaning to over 4 years of sleeping in this room. She had 4 minutes, maybe 5. She had been counting on 4. She sat on the edge of the bed with Isabella in the bassinet beside her and the burner phone in both hands, and her thumbs moving with the focused precision of someone who had rehearsed this in her head enough times that the muscle memory had formed without ever practicing it physically. The transfer protocol Cross had built ran through 2 relay points before it landed. It took 90 seconds for all 41 files. She watched the progress indicator move and breathed through her nose and counted the seconds against the sound of the shower. When the transfer completed, she sent a single text to the number Pierce had given her. 1 word. The word they'd agreed on, which was clear. And then she powered the phone down and put it back under the mattress, and had been lying on her side facing the window for approximately 90 seconds when the shower stopped. Damien came out of the bathroom in a towel and moved through the room in the dark with the habitual ease of someone who didn't need light to navigate his own space. He got into bed. He lay on his back. Within 3 minutes, his breathing had shifted toward sleep, or toward the performance of sleep. She could no longer be certain which, and the uncertainty itself was its own information. She lay still and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep at all. Pierce moved fast. By 6 in the morning, she knew because the burner phone vibrated twice under the mattress at 6:04, the signal that meant a message was waiting. He had spoken with his federal contact, a man named Garrett Voss, who worked organized crime out of the Newark field office, and who had, Pierce told her in the brief encrypted message she read in the bathroom with the faucet running and Isabella balanced on her left forearm, been waiting for something exactly like this for a very long time. Voss had the files by 6:30. By 8, he had listened to enough of them to make a phone call to his supervising agent. Serena didn't know any of this in real time. She knew it afterward, in the reconstruction that Cross walked her through weeks later. What she knew in real time was that she'd sent the files, Pierce had confirmed receipt, and now she had to get through a morning that looked exactly like every other morning, while something she'd set in motion moved through channels she couldn't see or control. She made breakfast. Damien came down at 8:15 dressed, phone in hand. He ate standing at the counter, a habit she'd spent 2 years finding mildly irritating and now found revealing, because it meant he was always positioned to leave without having committed to sitting, to staying, to any posture that required settling into a room. He looked at Isabella in the bouncer seat on the kitchen table, and then he looked at Serena and said, "You sleep?" "Some." "She keep you up?" "She's 12 days old." He almost smiled. Drank his coffee. His phone buzzed, and he looked at it, and the almost smile went away. "I'll be late tonight." "Okay." He left. She listened to the garage door in his car on the gravel, and then the gate, and then nothing, and she stood in the kitchen with Isabella and the remains of breakfast and the silence of the house and the particular quality of waiting that she'd been living inside for months, but which had now changed temperature. No longer the patient waiting of someone building toward a moment, but the acute waiting of someone who had already pulled the trigger and was watching the bullet travel. Cross called at noon. "Voss wants to meet." Serena looked at Carmen, who was in the far end of the kitchen with her back turned, doing something with the dish rack. "Today?" "Tonight, without Damien's knowledge. Pierce will handle logistics." "And Ellie?" "Bring her. Pierce is arranging a location with a secure room for the children. You bring both girls, and you leave the house as if it's a normal errand, and you don't go back." Serena understood what that meant. She'd known it was coming and had told herself she was ready for it, and was now discovering that knowing something is coming and having it arrive are separated by a gap that no amount of preparation fully bridges. She looked around the kitchen, the marble counters, the enormous range, the flowers Damien had never explained, and felt absolutely nothing for any of it, which was either a mercy or a numbness she'd deal with later. "What time?" she asked. 3:15. You pick Ellie up from school like normal, then you drive to the address Pierce sends you. A pause. "Serena, don't pack. If he has someone watching the house, and he may, bags are a signal. Take your documents, the phones, whatever fits in your coat pockets. Leave everything else." She thought about Isabella's things, the bassinet, the small, soft animals Ellie had arranged around it with the proprietary care of an older sister establishing territory. She thought about the coat in the hall closet with the lining where the burner phone had lived. She thought about what she was leaving and made herself stop thinking about it. "Understood," she said. At 2:15, she dressed Isabella in the warmest thing she had, a fleece sleeper with a hood, pale yellow, and put her in the car seat with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 12 days and had gotten good at it out of pure necessity. She put her own documents in the interior pocket of her coat. Birth certificates, both girls. Her passport. The folded paper with Cross and Pierce's numbers on it, which was redundant given that she had the burner phone, but which she'd kept because there was a version of this afternoon where the phone didn't make it, and the paper did. She drove to Ellie's school at the normal time. She signed the normal clipboard. She waited in the normal line of SUVs with their normal occupants doing the normal end-of-day ritual of collecting children, and she sat with her hands at 10 and 2, and her heart doing something she couldn't regulate no matter how she breathed, and Isabella making small sounds in the car seat behind her. Ellie came out at 3:18, backpack bouncing, talking to a friend she separated from at the curb with the informal abruptness of children who know they'll see each other tomorrow. She got in the car and looked at Serena and then at Isabella and said, "Why does the baby have her coat?" "We're going on an errand." "What kind?" "The boring kind." She pulled out of the school line. "How was today?" Ellie talked. She talked about a project and a girl named Madison who had said something and a substitute in art class who didn't know how the supply closet worked. Serena listened and responded and drove with total steadiness on roads she'd driven 100 times, heading in a direction that was not toward home. She turned onto the highway at 3:31. The address Pierce had sent her was 40 minutes north, a nondescript office building in a town Serena had driven through once or twice without registering. She found it without incident. She parked in the lot, which had 4 other cars and nothing that looked like surveillance. She'd been watching her mirrors the entire drive, with a focus that had made her eyes ache. Pierce was waiting at the side entrance. He was shorter than she'd expected from his voice, Mid-50s, compact, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of operating in the margins of dangerous things and had settled into a permanent expression of calibrated patience. He looked at Ellie first, then at the car seat, then at Serena. Any problems? No. Anyone follow you? Not that I saw. He held the door. Voss is inside, see? Garrett Voss was a tall man with close-cut gray hair and the particular posture of someone who had spent decades in institutions. A straightness in the back that was not quite military, but was its own form of structural discipline. He stood when they came in, which Serena hadn't expected, and looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who was looking at evidence rather than a person. She looked back at him with the same quality. She had earned that. Cross was already in the room, seated at the conference table. She looked exactly as she sounded. Sharp through the eyes, composed in the way that required effort rather than the way that comes from ease. She nodded at Serena. Pierce took Ellie and Isabella to an adjacent room where someone, a woman who introduced herself as Pierce's assistant and had the patient manner of someone who spent time with frightened children professionally, had set up what Ellie described audibly through the open door as actually a lot of snacks. The door closed. Voss sat down. Serena sat across from him. Cross was to her left. Ms. DeLuca, Voss said, I've listened to approximately 4 hours of the material you provided. I want to ask you some questions about the recordings and about your direct experience in that household. Before I do that, I want to be clear about something. He folded his hands on the table. I am not here as your advocate. My office has interests that overlap with yours and may diverge from yours. Do you understand that? Yes, Serena said. The recordings you provided contain material relevant to a federal investigation that has been ongoing for 14 months. That investigation has interests that will take priority. What I can tell you is that the content of these recordings, if authenticated, represents the kind of evidence that can move a very large case significantly forward. He looked at her steadily. It can also protect you. But I need to be honest. The protection is a consequence of the evidentiary value, not the primary objective. Cross said, Mr. Voss, my client understands the distinction. She also has 2 children who need immediate protective status, which we discussed as a precondition of this meeting. And I'm prepared to address that. Voss looked at Serena. You left your residence today with no indication to your husband of where you were going. Correct. When he realizes you're not coming back, he'll move, quickly. I know. The custody petition Cross told me about, the one you found in the filing cabinet, if he files that tonight or tomorrow morning with a judge he controls, we have a procedural problem regardless of the federal angle. He paused. We need to be in family court first. Tonight, if possible. Emergency filing, emergency custody hearing, emergency protective order. He looked at Cross. Can you get a judge tonight? I've been working that since noon, Cross said. Who? Judge Patricia Mercer, Family Court, Essex County. She's clean. I've worked with her. Voss nodded once. File everything, the divorce petition, the emergency custody motion, the protective order request. Attach the recordings as supporting evidence and note the federal investigation as corroborating context. He looked back at Serena. This is going to move fast. Your husband is going to find out what you've done. Not from us, but because when Cross files tonight, it becomes part of the public record, and his lawyers will see it within hours. I know, Serena said. And you understand that when he finds out, the situation in that household becomes irrelevant because you won't be going back to it. But the situation in every other way becomes significantly more dangerous. Mr. Voss, she looked at him without looking away. I have been living in a dangerous situation for 4 years. I have been managing it alone for the past 4 months. I understand what I'm doing. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not quite, but something adjacent to respect. All right. Cross filed at 6:47 that evening. Serena knew the exact time because she was sitting in the adjacent room with Ellie, asleep across 2 chairs with her head in Serena's lap, and Isabella in the car seat on the floor and a cup of coffee going cold on the table beside her. And Pierce came in at 6:47 and said, quietly, It's filed, and Serena closed her eyes for 3 seconds and then opened them because there wasn't time for anything longer. Damien's lawyer, not Meade, a secondary attorney named Castellano, who handled litigation, was apparently notified within 90 minutes, which meant Damien knew by 8:30 at the latest. Serena's phone, the real one, the one she'd left on the kitchen counter at home that afternoon because Cross had told her to leave it, started receiving calls at 8:42. She knew because the burner phone had a secondary function Pierce had set up, a mirroring capability that showed her incoming calls to her primary number without her having to be near it. She watched the screen. Damien called 4 times in the first 20 minutes. Then Rudy Farrow called twice. Then a number she didn't recognize was his lawyer, probably. She did not answer any of them. Pierce arranged a hotel. Not close, 40 miles from the house, booked under a name that connected to nothing Damien could reach. Serena drove there with Ellie half asleep in the back seat and Isabella cycling through the early night fussing that had become her signature, and checked in under the name Pierce had given her, and put Ellie in one of the beds and stood over the bassinet the hotel had provided and let herself be still for 10 minutes. Just 10. Because she could feel the incision pulling and her legs were unreliable in a way that meant she'd been standing on adrenaline for 6 hours and the adrenaline was starting to metabolize. Then she picked up the burner phone and called Cross. "Mercer," Cross said without greeting. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., emergency custody hearing. She reviewed the filing tonight and granted the emergency session." A pause. Damien's lawyers have already filed a counterpetition. His judge, Calloway, granted it in the family court system he controls. So tomorrow we have 2 simultaneous hearings in 2 different courtrooms. Serena sat on the edge of the hotel bed. Which one counts? Mercer is the correct jurisdiction. Calloway's court doesn't have standing to hear this case. The filing location Cross chose was deliberate, and it's defensible. But Damien's team is going to argue jurisdiction in the morning, and it's going to be messy before it's clean. And Voss? Voss's people are filing something of their own tonight, a federal motion that I cannot fully describe to you because Voss didn't fully describe it to me. But it will be in front of Mercer's court by morning, and it will establish that the recordings are material to an active federal investigation. Serena absorbed this. Outside the hotel window, the parking lot was orange under the lot lights, ordinary and anonymous, nothing like the life she'd been living in. What do I need to do tomorrow? Be in Mercer's courtroom at 8:30. Dress like yourself. Bring nothing that looks performative. Be exactly what you are. A pause, and this time there was something in Cross's voice that hadn't been there before, something that might, in another person, have been protectiveness. You've done the hard part. Tomorrow, we let the recordings speak. She slept 2 hours, maybe 3. She was up before 5, sitting in the hotel chair by the window with Isabella on her chest and the curtains open 2 inches, watching the parking lot go from orange to gray to the pale, flat light of early morning. Ellie slept through all of it, with the absolute commitment of a child who didn't know yet that anything had changed. At 6:30, Cross sent a message. Damien's team filed for emergency injunction to suppress the recordings on grounds of illegal surveillance. Motion is in front of a judge in his network. We're countering. Mercer is aware. Voss's people are already responding. Hold your position. At 7, Pierce called. How are you? Tell me something useful. Voss's office executed search warrants on 3 Moretti-connected financial entities at 6 this morning. Business addresses only, not residential. It's not an arrest, but it's visible. She understood what that meant. He'll know. He already knows. His lawyers have been on the phone with the U.S. Attorney's Office since 6:15. A brief pause. The cage is rattling, Serena. That's what you wanted. What I want is my daughters. Then be in that courtroom. She was. No. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent light mixed with inadequate natural light from 2 high windows, the smell of old paper and industrial cleaner that seemed to be the universal atmosphere of rooms where people's lives got decided by strangers. Judge Patricia Mercer was a woman in her early 60s with reading glasses on a chain and a face that had processed enough human misery to have stopped registering it as surprising without having stopped registering it entirely. Cross sat to Serena's left, A paralegal from Cross's office sat to her right with a laptop open, linked to the audio files. Damien's team occupied the other table. 2 attorneys, Castellano and a second man Serena didn't recognize, and a paralegal. Damien himself was not present. His absence landed in the room with its own weight. The hearing began at 9:04. Mercer read the filings with the thoroughness of someone who had not gone into this blind. When she looked up, she looked at both tables with the same level, assessing quality. "I've reviewed the emergency petition and the supporting documentation," she said, "including the motion filed by the U.S. Attorney's Newark office at 7:18 this morning." She paused. "Before we address the substance of the custody matter, I want to address the admissibility question because I understand that's going to be the first argument from the respondent's table." Castellano was already on his feet. "Your Honor, the recordings were obtained through an unauthorized—" "I'm not asking you to speak yet, Mr. Castellano." Mercer's voice was not unkind. It was simply a wall. "I'm telling you what I'm going to address." She picked up one of the documents in front of her. The U.S. Attorney's motion argues that the recordings constitute evidence in an active federal investigation and are therefore protected under federal evidentiary rules that supersede the state admissibility challenge. I'm going to hear that argument first. Cross was on her feet. "Your Honor, the petitioner is prepared to—" "I know you are, Ms. Cross." Mercer looked at her over the reading glasses. "Sit down and let me get there." What followed was 70 minutes of legal argument that Serena followed with the focused attention of someone who understood that this room was the entire battlefield, and that every word mattered, and that the only thing she could contribute to it right now was to sit still and look like someone whose children should be in her care. She sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her. She did not look at Castellano. She did not look at the door when it opened 20 minutes in and admitted a man she didn't recognize who handed something to Cross's paralegal and left. The paralegal slid a note to Cross without speaking. Cross read it, set it down. Did not change expression, but when she glanced at Serena, something in her eyes said, "We have it." Mercer called a brief recess at 10:15. In the hallway, Cross put her mouth close to Serena's ear. Harlan Meade formalized his cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office at 9:50 this morning. He's confirmed the authenticity of the financial structures on the recordings and provided documentary corroboration of the custody conspiracy. She pulled back and looked at Serena directly. "The recordings are real. Meade confirms it, and he confirms Damien knew exactly what he was doing." Serena looked down the courthouse hallway. Tile floors, fluorescent light, a water fountain on the wall. Completely ordinary, completely unlike the 4 years that had delivered her here. "And Damien?" she said. "His lawyers requested a continuance 20 minutes ago. Mercer denied it." She nodded. She could feel her legs. That was something. They went back in. At 11:40, Judge Mercer played 43 seconds of audio in open court. It was from the 8th recording. Damien's voice, unhurried and precise, describing what he planned to do to Serena in the weeks after she gave birth. The clinical detachment of it, the way he discussed her mental state as a resource to be managed, her love for her children as a mechanism to be used against her, her isolation as a condition he had engineered, filled the courtroom with the particular quality of silence that follows something that cannot be taken back. Castellano did not object. There was nothing left to object to. Mercer set the tablet down. She took her reading glasses off and held them in one hand and looked at the respondent's table with an expression that was not anger. It was something more fundamental than anger, something that had to do with having presided over family court for 19 years and recognizing in 43 seconds of audio something she had never quite heard so plainly before. "I've heard enough," she said, "to rule on the emergency custody matter." Serena's hand, flat on the table, pressed down hard against the wood. Mercer put her glasses back on. Pending a full hearing, the court grants emergency sole physical and legal custody of both minor children, Eleanor Moretti and Isabella Moretti, to the petitioner, Serena DeLuca. She looked at Castellano. "The respondent is ordered to have no unsupervised contact with either child until further order of this court." She paused. Additionally, the court is issuing a protective order prohibiting the respondent from approaching the petitioner or the children at any location. The paralegal at Castellano's table was typing. Castellano himself sat with his hands braced on the table, and his face arranged into the professional neutrality of someone absorbing a loss too large to show. Cross put her hand on Serena's forearm, just briefly. Then she removed it, because Cross was not a woman who lingered in gestures. Serena sat in the hard wooden chair in the small courtroom and looked at the judge, and felt something moving through her that wasn't triumph. Triumph was too clean for what this was. It was something rougher, something that had the weight of 4 years in it, 4 years of managing and performing and holding herself inside the shape of a life that had never been what she thought it was. And the weight of the past 4 months of carrying something so heavy in such silence that she'd stopped being able to remember what it felt like not to be carrying it. She thought about Ellie. Ellie, who was with Pierce's assistant right now, eating what she'd called actually a lot of snacks, not yet knowing that the thing Serena had been quietly fighting to protect since the morning a 7-year-old had asked why her father sounded so mean had just been, at least provisionally, secured. She thought about Isabella, 12 days old, already the subject of more adult machination than most people encountered in a lifetime. She looked down at her hands on the table. They were not shaking. Outside the courtroom doors, she could hear something. Movement, voices. The particular disturbance of institutional hallways when something is happening that isn't supposed to be happening yet. One of Voss's people appeared in the door to the courtroom and looked at Cross with a directness that communicated something without words. And Cross looked at Serena and said quietly, so quietly, it was almost just breath, "They're moving on him." Serena looked at the door. Beyond it, the ordinary tile hallway, the water fountain, the fluorescent light. Beyond that, somewhere in the geography of this city, the machinery that Garrett Voss had been building for 14 months was engaging with its target, and the man who had spent 2 years constructing the architecture of her destruction was about to discover what it felt like when the thing you'd built came down on top of you. She stood up. Cross was already gathering documents. The paralegal was closing the laptop. Mercer had left the bench. Serena put on her coat. She picked up the car keys. Her hands moved with the steadiness of someone who had come through the worst of it and was still standing, still functional, still present in her own body in a way she hadn't been entirely certain she would be when this morning started. She walked to the courtroom door and put her hand on it and felt the weight of it, and pushed through into the hallway, where the voices were louder now, and someone was on a radio and 2 men in suits she didn't recognize were moving with the particular urgency of people executing something that had been planned for a long time and was finally, irrevocably, in motion. She thought, "It's done." And then Cross appeared at her elbow and said, "Not yet," and showed her something on her phone, and what Serena read there told her that Damien, upon learning what had happened in the courtroom that morning, had done something that none of them had accounted for, something that changed the immediate geography of everything they'd just built, and the feeling in Serena's chest that had almost been relief collapsed back into the harder thing, the thing that had kept her moving for 4 months, and she looked at Cross and said, "Tell me." Cross showed her the message on her phone, and Serena read it twice. Damien had taken the jet, not fled. That was too simple a word for what he'd done, and Damien had never done anything simply in his life. What he'd done, within 40 minutes of his lawyers informing him of Mercer's ruling and the federal warrants executing simultaneously against his financial interest, was drive to Teterboro Airport with 2 of his most loyal men and board the Moretti organization's private aircraft, filed under a shell company that the federal investigators knew about but had not yet frozen because the asset freeze order had been filed at 10:50 and the FAA notification had lagged by 31 minutes. And in those 31 minutes, Damien Moretti had lifted off a runway in New Jersey and was currently somewhere over the Atlantic with a flight plan filed for Lisbon. Serena read it a second time. "He's running," she said. "He's running," Cross confirmed. She stood in the courthouse hallway with the noise around her and the coat on her arm and the car keys in her hand and felt the information settle into her body. Not shock. She was past the threshold where Damien could shock her. Something more like the recognition of a shape she should have seen sooner. A man who had spent his life building exits had used one. The fact that this particular exit would ultimately seal his fate more thoroughly than anything that had happened in the courtroom was a thing she knew intellectually, and the part of her that had spent 4 months learning how these mechanisms worked. The part of her that was still a woman with 2 children standing in a courthouse hallway processed it differently. He had left. He had left Ellie. She said, "Ellie doesn't know any of this." "No," Cross said. "She thinks—" Serena stopped, breathed. "She thinks she's eating snacks in a waiting room." Cross said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say to that. Serena put the car keys in her pocket. She looked at the end of the hallway, at the ordinary institutional rectangle of it, and she thought about a 7-year-old girl who had her father's dark hair and her dead mother's eyes and who had spent the past 4 years building an attachment to a woman who was not her mother out of the pure, undefended need that children have for someone to attach to. And she thought about what it was going to cost that child when the full shape of this became clear, and the weight of that, not her own loss, not her own ordeal, but Ellie's, was the thing that finally moved through her eyes. She blinked it back. Not now. "What does Voss need from me?" she said. What Voss needed was a recorded statement, a formal authentication of the recordings, and her cooperation with the federal investigation going forward, all of which Cross had anticipated and prepared her for, and all of which Serena provided that afternoon in a conference room in the federal building in Newark, with a stenographer present, and 2 agents she hadn't met before asking questions in the careful, methodical way of people who were building something designed to last. She answered every question. She answered them precisely and without embellishment, because Cross had told her that the most useful thing she could do for the case and for herself was to be exactly what she was. A woman who had found something she wasn't looking for and had made careful, deliberate choices about what to do with it, and not to perform either victimhood or heroism, because neither would serve her in the long run, and both would give Damien's eventual defense team something to work with. The statement took 3 hours. When she came out, Pierce was in the hallway with a coffee he handed her without asking if she wanted it, which was the right call. She drank half of it standing up. "Ellie?" she said. "With Cross's paralegal. She thinks you're in a long meeting." "Isabella?" "Fed and asleep about 40 minutes ago." She nodded, drank more coffee. Damien's plane landed in Lisbon at— Pierce checked his phone. 6:40 local time. Interpol has been notified. There's a provisional arrest warrant being prepared through the U.S. Attorney's Office that will be transmitted through the treaty channels. He paused. He's not going to stay in Lisbon. He has connections in 3 countries that don't have straightforward extradition arrangements with the U.S. Will they get him? Pierce looked at her with the honest directness she had come to understand was his primary quality. Eventually. These things take time. It may be months. It may be longer. But the case doesn't need him present to proceed. The financial charges can be tried in absentia on the evidentiary record. The custody matter is already ruled on by Mercer, and his absence only strengthens your position. He paused. His organization is already fracturing. 3 of his senior people made contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office this afternoon. When the leadership runs, the people below make different calculations. She thought about what Damien had built, the years of it, the architecture of loyalty and fear and money that he'd constructed and maintained with the patient. Exhausting attention of someone who understood that power was not a thing you had, but a thing you continuously performed. And she thought about what it must have looked like from the inside when the recordings surfaced, when the 41 files, preserved by a cartoon animal app on a child's tablet, began moving through federal channels, and the entire structure started showing its load-bearing cracks. "What about Bianca Romano?" she said. Pierce's expression shifted slightly. "She was brought in for questioning this afternoon. Her father, Marco Romano, is cooperating with the investigation through his own attorney. Bianca's position is complicated." He left it there. Serena left it there too. She didn't have energy left for Bianca Romano tonight, and the truth was that Bianca Romano was not, finally, the problem she'd once seemed. She was a symptom. The problem had been the man who had decided years ago that the people around him were resources to be managed rather than humans to be honest with, and that had caught up with him over the Atlantic at 30,000 feet. She finished the coffee. "I need to get my daughters." Ellie took the news in stages, which was the only way 7-year-olds could take news of this magnitude. Not all at once, not in a single conversation, but in pieces that Serena gave her carefully over the following days and weeks, calibrated to what Ellie could hold at any given moment without breaking under it. The first piece, that night in the hotel room, was the simplest. They weren't going back to that house right now, and that was okay. And Serena was here. Ellie sat on the hotel bed with her backpack on her lap and her jacket still on, and looked at Serena with the particular expression of a child whose threat detection system is more sophisticated than adults give it credit for. "Is Daddy okay?" Serena looked at her. "Daddy is safe," she said, which was true in the narrow sense she intended and insufficient in every other sense, but it was what she had for tonight. Ellie processed this. "Are we in trouble?" "No." "Are you?" "No, Bug. We're not in trouble." She reached over and unzipped Ellie's jacket, the automatic gesture of someone managing a child who has forgotten in the stress of things to take her coat off. "We're actually the opposite of in trouble." Ellie let her take the jacket. "What's the opposite?" "Safe," Serena said. "The opposite is safe." Ellie looked at her for another moment with those eyes that saw too much, and then looked at Isabella in the hotel bassinet, and then looked back at Serena. "Can I hold her?" "Yes." She helped Ellie position herself against the headboard with her arms correctly arranged, and she put Isabella into them, and she watched Ellie's face do the thing it always did when she held her sister. This soft, unguarded opening, the complete suspension of the vigilant monitoring she otherwise maintained. And she sat on the edge of the bed and watched them and let herself be still for a moment in the hard, plain fact of what she'd managed to keep. The weeks that followed were not easy. Nothing about the aftermath was easy in the way that people sometimes imagine justice is easy, clean, resolved, filed away. It was procedural and grinding and full of the particular exhaustion of legal processes that moved at their own speed, regardless of how urgently you needed them to move faster. Cross filed the full divorce petition. Mercer assigned a guardian ad litem to represent Ellie's interests independently, which was the right call, and also one that required Ellie to sit with a stranger and answer questions about her father and her home, which she did with the stoic cooperation of a child who had decided to trust Serena's assurances and was honoring that decision even when it was hard. The house, the Moretti house with its 12-foot ceilings and marble countertops, and the chair by the door that existed for Damien's coat, was frozen by federal asset order within the week. Serena didn't go back to it. Cross arranged for a moving service to retrieve the things that were legally hers and Ellie's: clothes, Ellie's artwork, the small soft animals arranged around the bassinet. She had asked for nothing else and expected nothing else and received, in the end, exactly that. They stayed in a rental apartment for the first 2 months. 3 bedrooms, ordinary ceilings, carpet that needed replacing. Serena found it the most comfortable space she'd lived in 4 years. Harlan Mead's cooperation with the federal investigation produced, over the course of 3 months, the documentary corroboration for everything the recordings had described: the offshore accounts, the bribed officials, the structured money laundering that had moved through a minimum of 11 entities over the course of the Moretti organization's recent history. Dr. Felix Orien, the psychiatrist whose name had appeared on the fabricated psychological evaluation Serena had found in the filing cabinet, surrendered his license in connection with the investigation and faced his own legal proceedings. The witnesses who had submitted written accounts of Serena's episodes at dinner parties were identified and interviewed, and their accounts shown to be constructed rather than observed. Damien's empire, examined under federal scrutiny, had the quality of all things built on the premise that the builder would never be examined. It was intricate and functional and completely unable to withstand light. Bianca Romano accepted a plea arrangement in the spring. The terms were not public, but Cross told Serena in general terms that Bianca's cooperation had been extensive and her sentence correspondingly reduced. Serena received this information with a flatness that was not forgiveness and was not hatred, but was something in between, the acknowledgement of a person who had made choices, and the choices had cost her, and that was the end of it. Damien was located in Montenegro in the 3rd month, living in circumstances that his lawyers described to the press as temporary arrangements, and that the photographs Serena saw in a news article described more accurately as a rented villa with a view of the sea and the particular air of a man who believed he was managing a situation rather than losing one. He was arrested by Montenegrin authorities on the strength of the provisional warrant in the 4th month and extradited to the United States in the 7th. Serena was not at the airport when he arrived. She had no interest in being at the airport. She was at the playground near their apartment, pushing Ellie on a swing set, with Isabella in a carrier against her chest making the small sounds she made when she was content, which had turned out to be almost the same sounds she made when she was asleep, and for weeks Serena had gotten them confused. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. She looked at it, read the headline, put the phone back in her pocket. "Higher," Ellie said. She pushed higher. The custody hearing, the full one, not the emergency session, was scheduled for the 9th month. By then, the criminal case against Damien was far enough advanced that the custody matter had the quality of a formality, which Cross had warned her against treating as actual good news, because nothing in family court was a formality until the gavel came down, and sometimes not even then. She sat at Cross's table in Mercer's courtroom again. The wood paneling, the fluorescent and natural light mixed badly, the smell of old paper. She had sat in this room before, and it had gone well, and she was sitting in it again, and it needed to go well again. And the part of her that had learned over the past 9 months to distrust the appearance of certainty sat with her hands flat on the table and kept her face neutral. Damien was present this time. He sat at the respondent's table in a suit that had been selected, she could tell, with the same attention to performance that everything he did was selected with. He looked the same, older, maybe, in a way that was less about the months that had passed and more about what those months had contained. He did not look at her when she came in. He looked at the table in front of him, and then at his lawyers, and then at the judge's bench. He looked at Ellie's empty chair. The guardian ad litem had arranged for Ellie not to be present, for a moment that lasted longer than the others. Mercer came in at 9:01. The hearing took 4 hours, which was shorter than Cross had told her to expect, and longer than the anxiety in Serena's chest could comfortably sustain. Castellano had been replaced by a different lead attorney, a woman named Fitch, who was clearly skilled and who did her job well, and who had, Serena thought, the look of someone doing a professionally competent job in service of a cause she had privately assessed as lost. The recordings were played again. Not all 41, selected portions, the ones that addressed custody and mental state and the conspiracy to use fabricated documentation. The courtroom had the same quality it had the first time, that particular silence, but different in texture. The first time, it had been the silence of something being revealed. This time, it was the silence of a verdict being confirmed. Damien sat and listened to his own voice. His face did not move. She watched him from across the room, not fixedly, not with the dramatic intensity of the thing she was living through, but with the flat, clear attention of someone cataloging. He sat very still. His hands were on the table. At one point, when the recording reached the section about using Serena's postpartum state against her, when his voice said, clearly and without hesitation, "Then we help her along," she saw his jaw tighten. That was all. When Fitch had exhausted her arguments and Cross had answered them and Mercer had asked her questions and the guardian ad litem had submitted Ellie's assessed preferences, the judge took 30 minutes in recess. She came back and granted Serena full permanent legal and physical custody of both children. She granted Damien supervised visitation with Isabella, not with Ellie, who was not his biological child, and whom the guardian ad litem had reported clearly did not wish to see him, to be arranged through a court-appointed facilitator if and when Damien had completed the required assessment process. She looked at Damien as she delivered this and said, in a voice that had no heat in it because heat was unnecessary, "This court has reviewed evidence of a sustained, deliberate campaign to defraud the petitioner of her legal rights, to fabricate documentation supporting a false psychological diagnosis, and to corrupt family court proceedings through the use of financial and institutional influence. These are not the actions of a parent whose primary concern is the welfare of his children. These are the actions of a person who treated his children as assets in a larger transaction. This court's ruling reflects that finding." Damien said nothing. His attorney said nothing. The air in the room said everything else. She was in the hallway outside the courtroom, coat on, Isabella in the carrier, crossed beside her with the paperwork in a folder under her arm, when she heard his voice behind her. "Serena." She stopped. Cross stopped. She turned around. He was in the hallway entrance 6 feet away, with one of his new lawyers at his elbow and a federal officer at a respectful but operative distance. He looked at her with the full weight attention she'd once spent years trying to read and had finally learned to read correctly. There was nothing performing in it now. Whatever he was doing in this moment, it was not a performance. "The girls," he said. "Tell me they're fine," she said. "They're healthy." He looked at the carrier, at Isabella, who was asleep against Serena's chest with her head turned to one side, and her fist, as usual, pressed against her cheek. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that Serena did not have a name for and did not try to name. "She looks like her sister," he said. "Yes." A silence. The federal officer shifted his weight slightly. "I didn't—" He stopped. Started differently. "I didn't plan for it to go this way." Serena looked at him. She thought about the 41 recordings. She thought about the filing cabinet. She thought about Ellie's face when she'd asked if they were in trouble, and Serena had said no. She thought about 4 years of a life she'd built inside a structure that had been designed, from before she entered it, to eventually discard her. "I know," she said. He seemed, briefly, to expect more. She gave him nothing more because there was nothing more that was hers to give. What he'd done was a matter of federal record now. What she felt about it was her own, and she was keeping it. She turned around. She walked to the elevator. Cross walked beside her. Behind her, she heard nothing further. No footsteps following, no voice. She pressed the button. The elevator came. The plea agreement, Damien's, filed in the criminal case, was reached in the 11th month. The charges were substantial, and the sentence was substantial, and the press covered it for 2 news cycles and then moved on to other things, because the world moved on, which was both its cruelty and its mercy. Serena read the coverage once and then stopped reading it. She had, by then, moved to a different city. Not far. 3 hours by car. A mid-sized place with a good school district and neighborhoods where nobody knew her name or her husband's name or what a Moretti was. Cross had helped with the mechanics of it, the new legal name she'd taken back, her birth name, DeLuca, the name her parents had given her before any of this. Ellie had kept Moretti legally, but called herself Ellie D at school, which had been her own idea and which Serena had honored without comment. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building with a small balcony that got morning light. Serena had put a chair there, and a small table, and a plant she was not particularly good at keeping alive, but which had survived 4 months regardless, which she took as encouragement. She sat there in the mornings when Isabella allowed it, which was increasingly often, because Isabella at 4 months was beginning to understand the concept of a schedule, at least in the approximate way that 4-month-olds could be said to understand anything. Ellie had a room with yellow walls because she'd chosen yellow without hesitation when Serena asked, and a bed she'd picked out herself from a furniture store where she'd walked the whole floor twice, with the serious, evaluative manner of someone who had been told this decision was genuinely hers to make, and was taking that seriously. She had a new school and 2 provisional friends and a teacher she'd described as pretty strict but actually fine, which Serena understood as high praise. There were hard days. There were days when Ellie asked questions that didn't have good answers, and Serena gave her the honest version of the answer calibrated to what a 7-year-old could carry. And Ellie sat with it in the way Ellie sat with hard things. Not deflecting, not performing distress, just holding it with a gravity that sometimes made Serena think the girl had been doing this, carrying things, since she was old enough to understand that some things needed to be carried. There were days when Isabella cried for hours, and the incision that had finally closed properly still ached in cold weather, and the single-parent logistics of 2 children at different developmental stages produced a fatigue so complete it had its own specific texture. Not tiredness, not exhaustion, but something beyond both of those that she'd started calling, privately, wait. And there were mornings like the one she was sitting in now, on the balcony in the morning light, with the plant that had survived 4 months on her right and the apartment quiet behind her because both girls were still sleeping, and a cup of coffee that was the right temperature, and nothing required of her for the next 20 minutes except to sit here and be present in her own life. She thought about how she'd stood in the kitchen, 8 months pregnant with burning eggs and a burner child's tablet in her hand, pressing play on something she hadn't known would change everything. She thought about the 41 files, the faucet running, the piece of paper folded in her coat pocket, Cross's voice like a wire carrying current, Pierce's blunt, useful presence, Voss across the conference table, folding his hands, telling her honestly that her protection was a consequence rather than a priority. The courtroom. Damien's face when he looked at Isabella in the hallway. She thought about Ellie's voice. Why does Daddy sound so mean on here? 7 words. A child who hadn't known what she was carrying when she carried it into the kitchen with both hands. The thing that had brought down one of the most powerful criminal organizations in 3 states, that had produced 41 audio files and federal warrants, and a custody ruling and an extradition and a plea agreement, had been a cartoon animal app with microphone permissions, and a 7-year-old who found something confusing and brought it to the adult she trusted most. Serena sat with that for a moment. She thought about the kind of trust that required, to find something frightening and confusing, and instead of hiding it, to walk it across the room and hand it to someone. She thought about what it had taken to be the person Ellie trusted enough to do that, and she thought about all the small, daily, unwitnessed work that made you that person. The being there, the answering, the sitting on the couch with coloring books, the saying yes to juice and no to performing Serenity, and yes to doing colors before Daddy got home. The plant on the railing caught the morning light in the particular way it always did at this hour, going briefly more green than it was any other time of day. Inside the apartment, she heard Isabella, not crying, the transitional sounds, the moving toward waking sounds. And then, a few seconds later, Ellie's voice, lower and deliberate, talking to the baby in the particular tone she had developed over the past weeks, a tone she didn't use with anyone else, that was somehow simultaneously childish and ancient. Serena listened. She heard Ellie say clearly, "It's okay, I've got you." She set her coffee down. She stood up. She went inside into the light of the ordinary morning to her daughters. The story that had begun with a little girl carrying something too heavy across a room had ended the only way stories like that can honestly end. Not with the villain punished alone, not with justice arriving clean and complete, but with the people who had been in danger no longer in it. With 2 children sleeping in yellow-walled rooms and then waking up, with a woman standing in her own kitchen in a city where nobody knew her name, and the morning coming in through windows that were hers, and the day beginning the way days begin when you have survived the thing you were afraid would end you. Simply. Quietly. With the particular, unremarkable grace of people who have come through the worst of it and chosen, in spite of everything, to still be here.